What if I told you that the next global economic crisis might not begin on Wall Street, but in a narrow stretch of water that's only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point? Sounds unbelievable, right? Yet that's exactly why millions of traders, governments, and energy companies keep their eyes locked on one place, the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this tiny maritime corridor. If that route is disrupted, the effects aren't limited to the Middle East. They can reach your gas station, your grocery bill, airline tickets, and even the price of everyday products. And that's why the latest developments are making financial markets extremely uneasy. Over the past few days, the conflict between the United States and Iran has flared up once again. The brief period of relative calm appears to be over. Military strikes have resumed, diplomacy has stalled, and both sides seem to have abandoned hopes of reaching another agreement. President Donald Trump has declared that the Memorandum of Understanding reached only recently is effectively dead, while Iranian leaders have responded by calling any future negotiations meaningless. Instead of sitting at the negotiating table, both countries are once again exchanging military blows. Then came the announcement everyone was afraid of. Iran once again declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Normally, news like this would send oil prices shooting through the roof. Surprisingly, that hasn't happened, at least not yet. Prices have increased, but nowhere near the dramatic spike that many analysts expected. And that creates an interesting question. If the threat is so serious, why do markets still seem relatively calm? More importantly, why does Trump appear confident enough to restart a conflict that only weeks ago he seemed eager to bring to an end? The answer is far more complicated than it looks. Many people are assuming this situation will play out exactly like the last round of fighting. But financial markets don't reward people who expect history to repeat itself. They reward those who notice what's changing. And this time, several crucial pieces of the puzzle are completely different. In today's video, we're going to break down why a nonlinear oil crisis is becoming increasingly likely. That doesn't mean oil prices gradually creeping upward over several months. It means a sudden, sharp surge that catches governments, investors, and consumers completely off guard. We'll explore 3 major reasons why this risk is growing, why markets may have underestimated the danger, and why the confidence we're seeing today could disappear much faster than people expect. The first reason begins with something most headlines aren't talking about. The global oil market is far weaker than it appears. If you watched our previous coverage, you'll remember that many experts predicted oil prices would explode the last time Iran threatened the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, the world seemed to absorb the shock surprisingly well. But that wasn't because the market was strong. It was because the world had a hidden safety net. Countries entered that crisis with unusually large emergency oil inventories. Governments and energy companies rapidly released millions of barrels from storage, increasing supply just enough to prevent panic buying and keep prices under control. Think of it like using your emergency savings to survive an unexpected financial crisis. It works perfectly, the first time. The problem is, once those savings are gone, the next emergency becomes much harder to survive. During the previous phase of the Iran conflict, countries released oil from their strategic reserves at an extraordinary pace. Those additional barrels kept supply flowing, reassured nervous traders, and prevented oil prices from exploding despite fears surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. But there's one catch. You can't keep withdrawing from the same account forever. After months of supplying the market, global inventories have been drained to unusually low levels. They simply haven't had enough time to recover. In fact, recent data suggests that many countries continued drawing down their reserves even after the ceasefire was announced. The goal was simple: push oil prices lower as quickly as possible and ease pressure on consumers around the world. It worked, but it also came with a cost. The cushion that protected the global economy during the last crisis has become much thinner. President Trump himself indirectly acknowledged this reality during the G7 summit last month. While defending the agreement with Iran, he argued that the world was only about 4 weeks away from exhausting available oil reserves if supplies remained heavily disrupted. Whether that estimate was perfectly accurate or not isn't really the point. The important takeaway is that even political leaders were openly warning about how tight the market had become. Now imagine entering another military escalation under those conditions. This time, if exports are interrupted, There are far fewer emergency barrels waiting in storage to soften the blow. And that's only the first warning sign. The second reason an oil price spike is becoming more likely has less to do with pipelines or tankers, and much more to do with psychology. Financial markets don't move only because of facts. They move because of expectations. During the previous round of fighting, many investors quietly believed President Trump would eventually back down before oil prices became politically dangerous. Why? Because soaring gasoline prices are something every American notices. You might ignore the stock market for weeks, but if filling your car suddenly costs dramatically more, you'll notice it before you've even finished pumping gas. With midterm elections approaching and markets already nervous because of uncertainty surrounding artificial intelligence and the broader economy, many traders assumed Trump wouldn't allow the conflict to drag on long enough to trigger a full-scale energy crisis. That single assumption shaped billions of dollars worth of investment decisions, and it may have been the biggest reason oil markets stayed calmer than expected. Here's something many people don't realize. When you hear on the news that oil prices have gone up, traders usually aren't buying physical barrels of crude oil and parking them in their backyard. Instead, most traders deal in something called oil futures contracts. Think of a futures contract as a reservation. You're essentially agreeing today on the price of oil that will be delivered a month or two later. As long as you sell that contract before delivery, you never have to receive an actual barrel of oil. That's why futures have become the backbone of the global oil market. During previous oil crises, traders rushed to buy these contracts because everyone wanted guaranteed access to future supplies. That surge in demand pushed futures prices higher, which then drove global oil prices even higher. It became a self-reinforcing cycle. The higher prices climbed, the more people panicked, and the more contracts they bought. This time, however, something different happened. Instead of piling into oil futures, many investors chose another option: insurance. Over the last several years, the financial market for insuring against sharp oil price movements has become far more sophisticated. Rather than betting directly on oil becoming more expensive, traders could simply purchase protection. If prices unexpectedly exploded, the insurance would compensate them financially. It was a much cheaper and less disruptive strategy. But here's the important part. Why were investors comfortable buying insurance instead of rushing into futures? Because they believed the worst-case scenario probably wouldn't happen. Most of the market assumed that if oil prices started rising too quickly, President Trump would eventually step back, pursue another ceasefire, or negotiate a deal before the situation became economically painful. In other words, traders were betting on politics, not just on oil. Today, that assumption looks much weaker. Over the past week, the conflict has resumed despite the political and economic risks. That sends a very different message to financial markets. It suggests that the White House may now believe accepting another one-sided agreement would be politically more damaging than continuing military operations. At the same time, the renewed fighting makes another ceasefire much harder to achieve. The previous truce has already proven fragile, and every new exchange of attacks erodes what little trust remained between Washington and Tehran. If investors begin accepting that reality, market behavior could change dramatically. Instead of relying mainly on insurance, traders may start rushing back into oil futures to secure future supply. And if millions of investors try to do that simultaneously, prices won't rise gradually. They could accelerate in a matter of days. That's exactly what makes nonlinear crises so dangerous. They're quiet, until suddenly they aren't. And just when the oil market was already becoming more fragile, another major conflict has been quietly adding even more pressure to global energy supplies. While much of the world's attention has been focused on the Middle East, another war has been quietly disrupting energy supplies, this time in Eastern Europe. Over the past month, Ukraine has significantly intensified its attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure. Initially, most of these strikes targeted Russian oil refineries, the facilities responsible for turning crude oil into everyday fuels like diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel. Why does that matter? Because crude oil by itself isn't what powers your car or flies an airplane. It first has to be refined into usable fuel. Damage enough refineries, and even if crude oil is still available, the supply of finished fuel begins to shrink. And recently, Ukraine expanded its campaign even further. Instead of focusing only on refineries, Ukrainian forces have also targeted Russian oil tankers operating near the Kerch Strait, the strategic waterway connecting the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea. These attacks increase the risk of disrupting Russia's ability to move oil and refined products to international markets. The consequences are already becoming visible. According to recent estimates, Russia's diesel production capacity has fallen by roughly 1/3. Production of gasoline and jet fuel has also declined significantly. That matters because Russia remains one of the world's largest suppliers of refined petroleum products. In fact, it's typically the second largest exporter of diesel globally. To prevent domestic fuel prices from soaring, the Kremlin has responded by restricting exports of several refined products, especially diesel. While this helps stabilize prices inside Russia, it removes even more fuel from international markets, tightening global supply just as tensions with Iran threaten crude oil shipments. Put those two crises together, and you begin to understand why analysts are becoming increasingly concerned. The last time markets avoided a major oil shock, they had emergency stockpiles, optimism about diplomacy, and relatively stable supplies from other producers. Today, none of those advantages look as strong. Oil inventories are lower, investor expectations are changing. Trust between the United States and Iran has deteriorated, making another ceasefire less likely. And at the same time, the war in Ukraine continues to pressure global fuel supplies. Individually, each of these developments would be manageable. Together, they create the possibility of something much more unpredictable, a rapid surge in oil prices that spreads through the global economy almost overnight. Now, it's important to remember that no one can predict exactly how events will unfold. Markets are influenced by countless moving parts, and geopolitical situations can change quickly. But history has shown that energy markets often remain calm until they suddenly aren't. And when that tipping point arrives, the impact isn't limited to oil companies or governments. Higher fuel costs ripple through transportation, manufacturing, food production, shipping, airline tickets, electricity, and ultimately the prices consumers pay for almost everything. That's why the coming weeks won't just be important for the Middle East or Europe. They could determine the direction of the global economy for months to come. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more in-depth analysis on geopolitics, economics, and the global events shaping our future, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think oil prices will remain under control? Or are we on the edge of the next major energy crisis? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.